We're good to go. So I have Duncan Gillard with me. Duncan's from the UK and has been working a lot with young people in schools, doing some amazing work with DNAV and also doing some amazing work with teachers and students and the whole school community on how to help young people. So I thought we might talk to him today. Tell us what you're up to, Duncan.
Hey, Louise. Good to see you always. Thanks for inviting me on. So the last year and a half or so, my colleagues and I over here in the UK have been working on a project called the Enable Inclusion Team. We got some funding from NHS England to set up this new project. One of the things that always amazes me about working with CBS-oriented models that are designed to be transdiagnostic, that's kind of part of what we talk about often, isn't it? Is just the incredible range of applications of these models. And yet, when you're working in novel spaces, it isn't always straightforward figuring out how you translate these models into effective systems, interventions, approaches, and so on to make a difference for the client group that you're supporting. And it hasn't been straightforward for us, this one, but we are doing well and we've got some really great outcomes that we're going to write up soon and that we're really proud of. So this project is designed for young people who are at risk of permanent exclusion from mainstream.
Well, let me just ask you, when you say not straightforward, you're meaning because there's the multiple levels of the community, the school, the families, the students.
Well, I think when you're working in novel situations, novel challenges show up that you can't foresee until you're inside it, living it, breathing it, tracking it, and finding out what works and finding out what doesn't. So for us, working with young people who are at risk of exclusion from mainstream, one of the really big novel challenges that showed up that I don't think we forecasted in quite this way is the challenges of engaging with that community of young people. Most of the young people we've worked with in this project have such a history of quite aversive relationships with professionals, and they bring that history to their relationship with us. And quite understandably, given that, they're like, why should I work with you? How are you a solution to the problems that I have? And maybe I don't have any problems
anyway. You're going to tell
anyway.
me how to think and feel. You're going to just tell me
Yeah.
that I should just say, how do I feel?
And you're going to try and get me to do stuff I don't want to do. You're going to try and get me to go into school. I hate school. I don't want to go into school. These kinds of things are showing up, I think, because of the histories of the young people that we're working with. And so it takes time for us to establish foundations of a good working relationship such that we can then do good work and we can go into places that may not always be easy with them, but may in the long run be helpful for them.
And I think it's exactly what DNAV is set up to do. But also, I think it's about what all of our helping work, whether it's psychologist or social worker or youth worker, all of our helping work should be nested inside these multiple contexts, because that's where humans live. We're not just a person who walks in the door and has difficulties with thoughts and feelings. It always comes in context with the people around us and the community around us and the things that we have to do work, go to school.
And so the way that we approach this work that I think is fundamental to the successes we've had so far is that we always say we work with the whole person in context. And a lot of schools folk, even educational psychologists by background, a lot of schools folk, I think we end up working too much with the student. That's not the whole person. That whole person is also a son or a daughter, a child, is a friend, is a niece, is a nephew, they're also all of these things as well, has a story to tell that includes but is also beyond their sense of self as a student. And so we work at the level of the whole person in context. And operationally, what that means for us is if we can be useful by working in the family home, that's where we go. If we can be useful by working in the wider community, well, that's where we go. And if we can be useful by working in the school, well, then guess what? That's where we go. So that's it sort of seems obvious. It's sort of well, obviously that's where we start. We go to where we can affect change the most, but the parameters around most psychological services that I come across here in the UK don't allow for that to happen. So mental health in schools teams, we train a lot of those folk here in the UK to use ACT and to use DNAV. They have to work in school. Well, guess what? Half the kids you want to work with, you need to be working with, they ain't coming into school. So you've got to go to where they are. That's a problem. But we don't have those kinds of parameters.
Your project is going to where they are.
Correct.
Tell me what you do in your project. But I know it's kicking
So-
some amazing goal. People who are listening to this, they want to know, what is he actually doing and why is it?
So one way of describing what we're doing is to say it's a little bit like a Reboot West project that you very well, and hopefully some others will as well. The whole idea is bringing evidence-based processes of change that for us are CBS oriented, so psychological flexibility processes, into the lives of children and young people. For us, it's about working with children and young people who are at risk of exclusion from mainstream school, because we know that health, education, employment, socioeconomic, housing outcomes, all of those things tend to be better for young people when we can keep them in mainstream education, right? So we bring those evidence-based psychological flexibility processes of care into the lives of children and young people where they're at. And we go to where we can affect the most change. And it sounds kind of crazily simple in a way, but if they want to meet us in the community, like the gym or the park or the cafe, or they want to go for a burger or something like that, that's where we go. We use that as a way of doing positive pairing work and building good rapport, building good foundations. And then we do the work there. We do the coaching work there. So we can work directly with school staff. We can work directly with young people. We can work directly with parents, or we can work with a combination of those three. It feels like a very bottom-up service in that sense of the word. We've worked with 36 young people to date, and our funding has just been nearly doubled. So we'll be able to work with, it's about 42 young people over the next year. So we've worked with 36 over a year and a half, and over the next year, we'll be able to work with about 42. And we're doing a whole bunch of training and supervision for what will be now 18 secondary school pastoral teams.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a cool piece, is that by next month, 18 secondary school pastoral teams will be trained and will be being supervised in using the DNAV model in this region. And that represents about 1/3 of all secondary schools across Bristol and the wider area, effectively having between 3 and 7 DNAV coaches in their schools. So that's kind of cool.
So those DNAV coaches are primarily working, or in your brief, they're primarily working with the kids at risk of exclusion, but their circle of influence must be much wider than that across these 18 schools.
So the cool thing about this project, which is called the CRISP project, CRISP is an acronym for Coaching for Resilience in Secondary Schools project, the CRISP project. Cool thing about this project, or one of the many cool things I think about this project, is that whilst our brief is to support, in terms of our intensive casework, is to support young people at risk of permanent exclusion, we have the freedom to provide this training and this ongoing supervision to these coaches. I think there's close to 80 of them in total. We're halfway through their training now. They don't just 80, yeah, in this region, about 80 secondary school pastoral teams who are now
secondary school coaches running around all doing DNAV
across 18 schools. It's cool.
That's wonderful.
So we don't want to restrict their practice, so they'll be working with young people at risk of permanent exclusion, but they'll also be using it for young people who are anxious about schools, young people who are maybe have got difficulties going on at home, maybe domestic issues going on and so on, young people who are anxious about and therefore not coming into schools, those kinds of things. So we're not restricting their practice, saying you can only use this for young people at risk of permanent exclusion. No, use it in any way you can. When you've got a young person in front of you who's struggling, we'll provide some support around that. And some of those young people will be at risk of permanent exclusion and some won't.
So can you share a story with me about some of the things that you've noticed? It can be data, because I know you've got hard data, or it could just be...
We've got some good data.
Story that people...
I'll tell you a story of a young person I'm working with, who I've recently finished working with. We did some coaching work with a 15-year-old young person. I was leading this particular case. Did some coaching work with a young person, 15-year-old. At the time we started working with him, he was just going into year 11, which is 15 transitioning to 16 years of age in that school year. At risk of exclusion, that's why he was referred to us. So this young person at 10 years old, on his 10th birthday, his dad died by suicide. His mum describes his dad as his best friend. It's emotional talking about it, actually. So he, the coming couple of years, a very trauma ill-informed response to what was going on. I think some level of sympathy, empathy, and attempt to try and support him through the emotions, but ultimately he was presenting with a lot of unsafe behavior, cutting out his feelings because he didn't have the language to do so, in ways that were unsafe toward himself and in ways that were unsafe toward others. And gradually over time, this self-story of I, the naughty kid, started to feed into his sense of self, right? As it does in these kinds of contexts, in my experience. I'm the naughty kid, I'm the bad kid, I'm the kid that does the bad behavior, I'm the kid that gets kicked out of school all the time.
Well, our advisors got to find a way to make sense of what's going on. And
absolutely.
usually we look inside, this is my fault.
So limped through mainstream school for about 4 or 5 years, lots of suspensions, lots of difficult issues, lots of fighting, other things that were going on as well. I won't go into them in too much depth here. But basically what happened was he became so at risk of permanent exclusion, he got referred to our service. And that happened just after a significant escalation in the level of safety he was presenting. And that was caused by alopecia. So overnight, he lost all of his hair, every hair on his body. Alopecia universalis. Now, teenagers and appearance, isn't it? That's huge for all of us. But I think appearance for teenagers is a massive thing. And that bears out in the research as being a significant factor in student well-being, is their sense of their satisfaction with their appearance. So overnight, this lad lost all of his hair, wore a bandana, very traumatic, very difficult for him to cope with. And again, that continued to come out in these same kind of unsafe behavioral repertoires, because I think socially he felt under threat, even more under threat and even less safe. So we started working with him. I always use that kind of metaphor of armor. It took a long time for us to chip away at the armor and get inside, and to start to help him get in contact with his noticer, to help him get in contact with the sense of there's more to me than this self I wrap around me to protect myself, this self I give to others. It took a long time to get to that point therapeutically, but we got there. There were some bumps in the road, and he managed to get through mainstream school. He finished year 11. He got good enough GCSEs that he was able to go on to college. He's now enrolled in his college of choice, doing his program of choice, which is art and design. And he's doing really well.
That's a really nice outcome. That's a really nice. Thanks for sharing that story. And anybody who's worked with kids who struggled in those kind of areas and end up excluding themselves or being excluded from school will know how hard it is to get people back in the system. So just tell me a little bit, just for the last few minutes, tell me a little bit about how you're actually measuring the outcomes, because I know you are. You don't know your data will still need to be evaluated and peer reviewed and all that stuff, but good to hear about data.
So we always been fiercely wedded since we started this project to being measured on the outcomes that we generate, or the difference we make, rather than how we get there. I think personally, I don't know what it's like over there in Australia, but I think here in the UK, there's too much focus on what you do and not enough focus on the effect of what you do, on the operant, in a way, if you like. How many kids did you see? How quickly did you see them? Levels of satisfaction, those kinds of things. It's like, yes, I'd be like, that is important. I get that, but it's secondary. What's more important is what difference did you make? So we have KPIs. We have one KPI linked to activity, which is the number of young people that we see over a particular period. But we also, all of our other KPIs are linked to outcomes. So we have an outcome linked to simple nominal data, which is yes, no, or did the young person get permanently excluded or not? Obviously, our commissioners are very interested in that. In terms of that KPI, 36 young people we've worked with, 33 were not permanently excluded, which puts us at a 92% success rate in terms of keeping young people in mainstream. So we're pretty happy with that.
That is really, I know that data and how important that data is. That's the data that makes you just like, yes, we're keeping them in schools, and that's what you need to do.
Thank you. It's great, because not all of our kids come to us at imminent risk of permanent exclusion. So they're out the door. So people are not expecting them to stay. So we've kept 92% in, which is great. We also have KPIs around general psychological well-being, and we use the SDQ for that. It's not the best measure for our purposes, but we have to be pragmatic and we have to be workable, and it's an easy measure to administer. People understand it, we find, and it's got the flexibility of you can ask teachers to respond, parents to respond, or young people if they're old enough to respond. So it has a lot of pros for us pragmatically out there in the field. So we use the SDQ, and if we aggregate the 4 core subscales, all of which are negatively valent, so you can aggregate those and then aggregate it across our population of young people, we see changes in the right direction of nearly 6 points from pre to post.
That's fantastic. That's good change.
If I recall correctly, a change of 3 points is clinically significant, so 6 points is good. We've also got we do the pro-social behaviour subscale of the SDQ, which is the only one that's positively valent, so you can't aggregate that one if I understand it correctly. So again, that one's moving in the right direction. So on measures of that is a kind of self-report measure of pro-social behaviour, that one's also moving in the right direction. So that's 3 KPIs. Another one relates to inclusion, as in being in school, more inclusion by location, if you like. So what we see in our populations, because 97% of them come to us on part-time timetables, so they're not accessing anywhere near their legal entitlement to education. And so we see a 1.5, so it's 10 sessions in a school week, right? So we see a 1.5 session per school term increase per child on average. And so because we work on average for about 6 months with our kids, that comes out in the wash as about 4.5 sessions per week more in school from pre to post our work. So that's great. And then the last
6
one
months, and you would imagine that if they're
in 6 months.
engaged in school, that's going to have an exponential increase over time. Slowly,
Yeah.
whereas the usual path for these kids is slowly decreasing until they're not in at all.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I wonder you got extra funding.
Yeah.
You deserve extra funding.
Well, that's cool. So we were 2 years on about 250,000, and now we've been given a 3rd year and enough funding to double in size. So it's 2 wins really. We've got a 3rd year's worth of funding, and then the funding will be reviewed after that, and we're going to be twice the size. So we've got amazing people coming to our team. I'm intimidated and excited in equal measure. An exciting time for us, and we've got national ambitions and maybe beyond national as well. So in terms of the plan for the future, we don't just want to demonstrate efficacy and continue to demonstrate efficacy at the regional level. We want to scale up to national, but we also need to demonstrate replicability before we start to lobby the government for a national program. So we're working with commissioners in an area about 100 miles or so from here, in an area called Dorset, to try and set up a replication of our project, which we'll supervise and support the setup of. And I think if that goes well, and we get some good studies under our belt, a couple of which are just in the post, I think then we're in a position to lobby the government for a national program. So it's exciting.
Awesome. I'll leave you with one more question, because people ask me this in all of my trainings. People always ask, how can they do something? So people always say, what can I do? How can I influence my school? How can I influence my kids who are dropping out or failing away? What can I do?
I'll be really practical about it then. This is what we've learned. You need about 1 day a week of commissioning for about 6 months from whoever is interested in commissioning work to work with young people at risk of exclusion. So whatever that equates to in terms of your daily rate or your services daily rate for psychological support, that's roughly what you need. Ideally, you'd have a little bit of assistant psychologist support if you have an organizational structure that lends itself to that as well, to kind of get in and do some of the coaching work with staff and with parents, the younger kids this is, to make sure that they're responding in ways that are kind of consistently reinforcing the kinds of behaviors that you want to see and the kinds of behaviors that you're targeting with your young person. That's one key thing. Another key thing is, if you're working with primary phase kids, put most of the focus on your direct work with parents and the other adults around the young person. Don't work directly with the young person. Like, you can't be there 24/7 and they can be. So help them respond better to the way that the young person's showing up. For the younger kids, work with the adults around them. For the older kids, well, it's developmentally appropriate, right? That adults lose their social capital over time. That's normal. That's the way it should be as young people become more independent adolescents. So with adolescents, go more to them, work directly with the adolescents themselves, help them to become independent young people in the world and to have the life that they want to have. And then I think one other thing
you're going to say is use DNAV.
Obviously, use DNAV, but in a holistic way. Use DNAV, obviously, Louise, but in a holistic way. So bring it to the whole young person in context. Don't just bring it to the student, bring it into their communities. Go to where you can affect most change and push against the system when it tries to make you a top-down practitioner that says, no, you have to work in schools, or no, you have to work in the homes. No, if you really care about outcomes, focus on where you can affect change and go there. And yes, use DNAV.
That's awesome. Thank you, Duncan. Oh, it's really delightful. I can't wait to hear what happens next.